So today Max and I are going to reflect upon the video recording or the video commentary made by our Chinese partners in um, China. Um, First of all, we mostly agree with most of the points that our Chinese partners made, and we totally agree with the point that the US imports of aluminum actually mostly consists of the imports from Canada instead of China. So as a result, Trump's argument that the Chinese aluminum imports into the United States can possibly be a flawed argument. And also, we believe that most of the key economic concepts that our partners in China have made are mostly correct. I would say mostly correct. There are a few mistakes. And now here I want to point out a few small mistakes that our Chinese partners have made in their commentary video. So the first, tariff it's not really as what you guys said that to be used to measure the rise of aluminum price. Instead, tariff is more like a tax the government imposes on the foreign imports. For example, if the United States imports aluminum from China, then the US government would be likely to impose a tariff on the goods and services imported from China. As a result, there will be an additional tax on the goods and services imported from China, and this is what we called a tariff. And this is really different from what our partners in China have said, that a tariff is a measurement of the rise in aluminum price. Another mistake I want to point out that our partners in China have made is the confusion of excess and surplus. I think in one of their slides they have mistakenly referred to the excess of supply by the surplus of supply. I think it's really important to understand that there is a drastic difference between surplus and supply. Surplus consists of consumer surplus and producer surplus. And surplus means the amount of an asset or resources that exceeds the portion that can be utilized. Well, excess excess of supply means the quantity of goods and services supplied is more than the quantity demanded. So these two are really different concepts. And we also don't really agree with one of the arguments that our Chinese partners have made. They argue that the Chinese government utilizes environmentalist risk regulation or environmentalist policies that have strangled the Chinese workers or the producers. And we don't really agree that the Chinese government would use like an environmentalist policy, because in order to create an overcapacity or an excess of supply, the government wouldn't use environmentalist policies to restrict the output or the production. Um, Instead, the government would use a loose environmentalist policy to encourage the production or the output. And we believe that it's more likely that it's the US government that have been using the environmentalist policies to restrict the imports from China. Because in order to make their products to be sold in the United States, the Chinese firms have to gain an additional license or a license that meets this environmentalist standard of the US market. So this may create an additional fee or expenditure for the Chinese producers. And also the whole procedure makes the selling of Chinese aluminum in the US market much harder than before. So it is more likely that the US government uses the environmentalist regulation as a protectionist policy in order to reduce the amount of Chinese aluminum that are sold in the United States. And there are a few phenomena that we think would have been way much better if you guys have explained it with diagrams and more details. First is the explanation of the reason why lots of American firms have to shut down under the influence of the Chinese imports of aluminum, of the cheap aluminum. And as we can see from this graph, and now we are going to evaluate the phenomenon that you guys have presented with diagram and more detail. So as you can see from this graph and this diagram is under the theory of the firms, and it is from a microeconomic perspective. And as we can see, the ATC is the average total cost, and the ABC is the average variable cost, and the cost between these two costs is the average fixed cost. So the average fixed cost is the average cost a firm has to endure as long as its business is running. And the cost can be prevented when the firm shuts down its business. So when a firm shuts down, it no longer needs to pay the average fixed cost, which is the cost between the average total cost and the average variable cost. And the average fixed cost plus the average variable cost is the average total cost. When the cheap Chinese imports enter the US market, it creates a price that is lower than the previous domestic price of aluminum in the US market. Thus, as we can see in the diagram, the price decreases from a level higher than P to P1, which is below the AVC, the average variable cost. At this point, the loss an individual firm will suffer from when it remains open will be much higher than that when the firm shuts down. Because as you can see from the graph that when a firm shuts down, the loss will only be the loss of the fixed cost, which is the area above AVC and below ATC. But if the firm keeps running, the loss will be even higher. The loss will be the area between the MC and ATC. This is an area that is much larger than the area that is simply the fixed cost. As a result, in this case, it is much more beneficial for the firms to shut down rather than keep the business, as the loss will be much lower when the firm chooses to shut down rather than keeping the business running. So in conclusion, as the Chinese goods and services enter the US market with a much lower price, lots of the US firms will have to face the situation to shut down in order to avoid a higher loss. After explaining the reason why lots of US domestic firms will have to shut down after the entrance of Chinese goods and services with a much lower price in the US domestic market, we would like to now look at the situation from a macroeconomic perspective to analyze the reason why there will be a much higher unemployment rate in the United States due to the cheap Chinese aluminum imports.
In your video, you mentioned that China producing to overcapacity causes aluminum plants in the US to close down and workers to be laid off, thus creating unemployment. But you nevertheless did not explain why Chinese aluminum production affects the American industry that much, given that, as you said, only 6% of US aluminum imports come from China. So, the reason lies in the fact that China produced 54% of the world aluminum production in 2016, according to our article. This means that they will have a tremendous influence in determining the world price as they are the largest producer. Therefore, because of the relatively cheap labor and on one hand, and mainly because of the government subsidies. On the other hand, China has lower costs of production than most other producers. So they are driving the aluminum world price down, putting pressure on countries with higher costs of production, like the United States. As already explained, only a fraction of the previously existing American aluminum producers are prepared to supply at the new low world price, causing the demand for labor in this market to decrease, thus causing the quantity of labor to decrease as shown on this graph. And this is how the Chinese overcapacity creates, the Chinese aluminum capacity creates unemployment in the US. You probably already understood all that, but you did not explain it clearly in your video. In conclusion, we think that you guys did a good job explaining overcapacity in the production of aluminum in China and the factors behind it. And we think that your understanding of the article seems to be rather good. Nevertheless, there are a few points that could be, in our opinion, improved. For example, although you pointed out that Chinese overcapacity affects the American aluminum market, you did not really explain how, but also this is a topic that is more relevant to international economics that I don't think you have studied yet. Otherwise, you just confused the terms surplus and excess, and there seemed also to be a little confusion with tariff and environmental regulation that are applied by the American government and not the Chinese government. But overall, we thought that your video was quite good. So thank you very much and goodbye.